just going to open it up here. Thank you guys all so much for joining us today. We've got some stellar content here for you from Beck and Sarah. We're going to be going over personalized and scalable, but making your winning playbooks and just sequences that work. Just some housekeeping moments before we go. We're going to make sure that we answer all of your questions throughout. So please go ahead and throw anything that you have in the chat or in the poll, or I'm sorry, in the Q&A, and we'll pull those out as we go. And also at the end, we'll reserve about 10 minutes at the end just for Q&A. So with that, I'd like to, Beck and Sarah here as well. We're going to have them introduce themselves a little bit, but Sarah, if you want to take it away.
Hi, so I'm Sarah Hicks. I'm Senior SDR at Predictable Revenue. I've been working there for about 1.5 years now, and yeah, just trying to find the best way to make use of kind of the content that's out there to be able to personalize and kind of make great relevant messaging. And that's what actually brought me to Beck and kind of brought us together to do this webinar.
Awesome. That's a good recap. Hey, everyone on the line. My name is Beck Holland. First, I'm going to nerd out a little bit about Sarah, and I put it on LinkedIn today, but just so everyone knows, this whole thing came about because Sarah is a practitioner, and I thought this was like unbelievable that you did this. So Sarah tuned into one of the personalization at scale webinars that I'd done in the past, deployed the messaging system, overachieved quota, and then you reverse engineered it, right? And you basically said, okay, I think that I can add something to this approach, which I absolutely love, because I'm always constantly trying to tease out people in the industry who can add to that thought, or like, I start a trend or start some kind of thread, and then people can build on top of it. And then you did a podcast. So everyone on the line who hasn't listened to the podcast, if you go to the Predictable Revenue podcast, Sarah, you did one 3 months ago, correct?
Yeah, thereabouts.
Yeah, on the approach. And so today's going to be an extension of that. Before we get going into the content here, I want to know who's on the line. So give a shout out in the chat. If you wouldn't mind, give your name, your title, give me a 1 if you're in sales, 2 if you're in BDR, in sales development, and 3 if you are in marketing, and 4 or if you are in another department, so I can get a good sense of who's on the line. Awesome.
Cool.
So we've got a lot of 1s and 2s. A lot of 1s and 2s. So we got sales and BDR mostly on the line.
Nice.
Okay, awesome. They're all piling in here. Can you tabulate all those people, Sarah?
Oh yeah. Great.
What the actual percentages are? Okay, this is awesome. Like Sarah Hauser mentioned, we got 2 Sarah H's on the line today. So like Sarah Hauser mentioned, if you guys have any questions, we want to make this as interactive as possible. We don't want this to be a dead one way. So if you have any questions along the way, please, please, please rack them up in the Q&A or in the chat, and Sarah Hauser will be going through them ad hoc, and we will have a 10-minute Q&A on the back end. So any kind of questions that you have, please feel free to stack them up in there. As far as the content today, so, I wanted to, for those of you who have seen the Personalization at Scale webinar that I've done in the past, if not, we will be sending out the link afterwards. But basically, I had done this approach where, I typically tell the story of I was an SDR at one point, and I remember getting some like pretty decent results. And I remember walking into my apartment one day and coming in and laying on the floor over here and staring at the ceiling. And I asked myself 2 questions. And I'm going to ask you all on the line those 2 questions that I asked myself at that point that were probably the most dangerous questions in my career. Number 1, if you go to the chat, who in here, with a yes or no, who in here responds to unpersonalized messaging, whether that's emails or cold calls, by taking a meeting with an SDR? We're just piling in no's.
Pretty resounding no.
Yeah, of course not. Hard no, very rarely. Negative, not even close. Okay, so that was the same answer that I had. And number, love them, and then someone said psych. Now I'm going to ask you the second question. Who in here thinks that your prospects are different than you in that regard? Got a whole bunch of no's. I haven't seen a yes yet. So that was basically the pinnacle point in my career where I decided, I'm like, okay, I think that the answer here is personalization, because I didn't answer any kind of messages that weren't actually addressed to me. And at the time I was selling into a marketing ICP, and I realized like, okay, the higher up you go, whether that's a manager, director, head of, or VP, or the kind of people that I want to get a hold of are going to be the kind of people that are going to have the same exact answer as you guys in the chat. So I realized, okay, there's, the way is going to be personalization, but I have to figure out how to do two things to actually make this work for the industry. Number one, I have to figure out how do I add some kind of structure to it. So I knew a lot of people would come back to me with like, okay, I have new onboarding SDRs. I have people who are just very new to the field. I want to make sure that I control them in terms of, messaging, and make sure that they're on buyer persona, and make sure that they're on brand, and make sure that they're not saying anything that we wouldn't say as a company. And then the second question that I knew that I would have to answer for the industry was, how do I scale it? So I had been trained by a couple of classical designers. A little bit about my background: I was an account executive for 5 years and then transitioned out to the Bay Area. And when I became an SDR, I had inherited quite a bit of training material. So I have been through Sandler training, I've been through Winning by Design training, I've been through Challenger, I've been through Medic, I've been through MedPick, I've been through ad hoc trainers like MJ Hoffman, I've seen John Barrow's stuff, Jake Dunlap stuff. And I was like, okay, how do I put this together in a meaningful way? And how do I actually scale personalization? So one of the trainers that I was really impacted by at the time, his name is Dan Smith, absolutely lethal. He's over at Winning by Design for anyone who's looking for a trainer. But he was the first one that really challenged me and said like, hey, personalization can be done. And so I said, okay, well, I have to set out on the journey to figure out how to scale this in terms of volume and messaging. So I went to Trish Bertuzzi and, Bridge Group and said like, okay, what's the average activity metric that you guys have per day? And they shot back with, it's 52 dials, 52 cold calls that BDRs are making per day. So I knew that that was the golden metric. So I deployed this messaging at my first company. And I remember saying to my leadership, I think back to this moment, I think I'm not sure why I had the temerity to do this, but I basically went to them and said, hey, I have an idea. And I want you to give me full autonomy. I don't want you to send me one Slack, not one Slack message, no questions. And if I can't 2x your numbers in a month, then I want you to fire me, because a leader without great instincts isn't much of a leader. And so I deployed the personalization at scale approach at the first company. And we deployed it on March 1st, March 5th, we had 2x, March 10th, we had 3x, March 15th, we had 4x, and we held at 4x with the same amount of people and same exact people. So I started pairing with a bunch of different sales engagement vendors, some notably Outreach, SalesLoft, Zant, Yesware, Groove, and said like, how do I scale this? So today, as far as infrastructure of the session, and why don't we just go ahead and jump in here? I'm going to start with how can you work this into sales engagement? Of how can I scale a personalized approach using a sales engagement vendor. So today I'm going to use Outreach. That's who I'm using currently. But again, you can use this with any of the sales engagement vendors that I just mentioned if you're using someone who's different. I'm then going to transition to how can you pick a reason for reaching out. So what should we personalize on? How do we tie that into being relevant? So we make sure we're personalized and relevant both. And then I'm going to hand the mic over to Sarah, and she's going to take us through how to reverse engineer the approach. Does that sound good, Sarah? Anything to add?
Sounds great to me.
Okay, awesome. So why don't we start with the sequencing work here with how do you scale personalization? So again, I'm using Outreach in the example today, but basically all the sequences that you build within your engagement vendor, you can build them on different scenarios. So I pitched here a comprehensive deck of all of the different scenarios that I am building my sequences off of. On the left-hand side, I put premises that I would mention the premise of Outreach. And then on the right-hand side, I put here the bucket of premises that I wouldn't mention why I'm reaching out. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So Over here on the left-hand side, we have a lot of what we call postbound triggers. So what is postbound? Inbound is going to be demo request, outbound in a hand raiser. Outbound is going to be someone who's never heard of us before, and then postbound is going to be everything in between. So your non-hand raising inbound. So we've got content downloads here, event attendees, webinar registrants, executive churn. I use a platform called User Gems to track if someone was using Chorus at a company and then churned to another company. If they hit ICP and they're a new company that we want to sell into, there's a very logical, use case there and a very reasonable chance that they would want to buy Chorus again. So I have a platform that automates this for me. Firmographic triggers like hypergrowth, or they share a common VC, or they demoed in the past. But basically over here on the left-hand side is going to be all of the different scenarios and sequences that I'm building within Outreach, where I do in fact mention the premise. I mention it for context and I transition on to an outbound premise, and we'll get in how to do that later. But these are all the comprehensive list of sequences that I'm using. On the right-hand side, like I mentioned, these are going to be sequences where I'm using them to funnel them into a sequence, but I'm not mentioning the reason for my outreach. I'm making it all about them. So, a great example here is company funding. So I see a lot of SDRs reach out to me and say like, hey, I noticed that you guys, just raised a whole bunch of money. Do you want to buy my shit? Because I sell shit for money. Is basically the premise. So you want to be sure that, company funding is a great trigger for people who are selling tech, but it does not matter to the person who you're selling into. So it matters to me as a seller, but it doesn't matter to them as a prospect. So all of these premises over here, website views, email opens, or any kind of dark funnel providers like, G2 Crowd, 6 Sense, Bombora, Trust Radius. I would use these as scenarios to pile my prospects into these sequences of like, there's probably a high buying rate here and they probably are in market if they just received a bunch of company funding. Usually that comes along with tech purchases and they are in hypergrowth in terms of team size, but I don't mention that as my premise. So what I do mention is I usually typically mention the postbound premise of, for all of you on the line today, it would read something like this, hi, Sarah, reason for my outreach is I noticed that you attended the predictable revenue webinar, but more importantly, and then I pick some kind of premise that is about my prospect, something that they did, something that they said, something that they engage with on LinkedIn, but I basically want to transition the glory, transition the light, and transition the focus off of how great my company is and off of the content that we did and talk all about the prospect at hand. So for all you on the line who hit ICP, if you are manager level and above and we haven't sold into, you'll probably get I hope, get some kind of email from one of the reps that will say, hey, I noticed that you attended this predictable revenue webinar, but more importantly, and then they will be talking all about something that you did, said, or liked on LinkedIn. And we'll get into a couple of those premises later and how to pick one. But this is how it's set up from the scenario perspective. As far as what the sequences look like, and sorry, this is kind of eating our vegetables early on the webinar, but as far as what the sequences look like within sales engagement, I get a lot of questions on what the actual sequence looks like. Our sequences over here, regardless of the scenario that we're playing off of, are 16 steps over 21 business days. We have 5 emails in total, 10 cold calls, and 1 step at the very beginning that you'll see here where they research the person's LinkedIn and they hunt for different outbound cold premises that they can store within sales engagement, that they can leverage for the rest of the sequence. So at this step, a great video to watch. I did a video on how to pick 3 premises in under 5 minutes, on LinkedIn, but basically at this step, and we can include that in the follow-up, but in this step, they're going to the person's profile, they're going to Sarah's profile and saying, okay, what are the premises that I'm going to use that are about Sarah, not about Sarah's company, not about predictable revenue, not about her role as a senior SDR, not about, her title or any kind of tech stack premises, but what has Sarah in specific done that I can relate back to what Chorus does. So the entire shell sequence is what we call it over here. Again, it's going to be 16 steps over 21 days, and it's more aggressive on the back end in terms of the volume of outreach. So you'll notice here in terms of the sequencing steps that we're lighter on the front end and we're more aggressive on the back end. This is based on MJ Hoffman. He's the author of Why You Now. He did pretty extensive research on how to sequence people. And what he found was that if you are more aggressive on the front end and you are lighter on the back end, you're teaching your prospect, Sarah, I'm coming to you. You're teaching your prospect that if they just wait long enough, then you'll eventually do what?
Sorry, I just had to unmute myself there. Then you're giving up.
Yeah, exactly. So you're going to teach your prospect that eventually you're just going to give up, you know, if they just wait long enough. So you want to flip that in terms of how you're sequencing to where you're a little easier on the front end and then you're more aggressive on the back end. So they get to know you through the personalized outreach. They realize that you know who they are. But these are some of our higher trigger rates in terms of responses, and positive responses are near the back end of the sequence because they realize somewhere around day 19 or 20 that if they don't respond, that you're not going to go away. When it comes to personalizing for just cold outreach, we've done postbound, you know, whenever you're mentioning some content or webinar or event. Whenever you're personalizing for just cold outreach, I typically tell the reps over here that they want to mention you know, one bucket summary and then one line that stood out to them about whatever they're talking about. So again, we'll get into what kind of premises you're picking when it comes to personalization, but regardless, when someone's reaching out from our team, if it's a cold piece of outreach, if they don't have any content to go off of, if they don't have any webinars, if they don't have any events that the person attended, you know, if they don't have any firmographic triggers or they didn't research you on G2, then they are picking out one line, they are picking out a bucket premise summary, and they are also giving one line in specific that stood out to them to really drill it home. Why don't we skip into personalized buckets and how to rank them into sales engagement. When it comes to scaling something, scaling anything, there are two things that you have to do, in my opinion. Number one, you have to build some kind of structure. And then number two, you have to like some kind of structure and some kind of prototype. And then second, you need to learn how to put gas on it. So in terms of structure, I have structured into our outreach instance where you can, and this will take you about 7 minutes to do for any outreach users on the line. I've put in any kind of different piece of personalization tidbit that they could personalize on into the custom tags. So if you go down to your custom tags, there's default 35 in outreach and you can expand to 50. Sales Loft, I believe is unlimited. But you basically, I can put in all of these custom tags. So you'll see here like self-authored LinkedIn article excerpt, you know, self-authored webinar title, webinar excerpt, LinkedIn post premise, LinkedIn post excerpt, you know, engage content. We'll go into these different buckets later, but I basically am ironing into all of my different prospect level views, everything that they could personalize on so that they have the structure of even how to pick out a premise. Then once you hit save on those custom tags at the prospect view, now Sarah, every single time that she is researching someone, she can pull out 3 different premises from their LinkedIn profile. She can hit save, and then every single time that she calls, so I use my friend Scott Barker in this instance. So I like use this premise that he had a post the other day is about seeing is believing. And one of the pieces of the post that really stood out to me was, but the key is that I had to see it first. I put those into the custom fields, I hit save, and now every single time that I call Scott, I'm going to get those surfaced to me whenever I call him. So one of the things I'd run into the past, for anyone out there who's on the line who's been personalizing in the past, I imagine, you know, that you've been using some kind of ad hoc Google Sheets, you know, some kind of document where you're storing all of this research. And the problem that I had in the past is basically I have all this research and then someone, you know, you're cold calling all day long. And I think the industry average is that you get 4 connects per day. So you're almost not expecting it whenever they pick up. And so one thing that I had struggled with was, okay, they pick up, and now I'm shuffling back and forth, between to try and find the sheet where I had all that wonderful personalized research. So if you iron it into your sales engagement vendor, then once you hit save, it doesn't matter if I call Scott once, or I call him 17 times, or I call him 100 times. Every single time that I call him, this research is going to be bubbled to the top for me, for all of those out there who you have prospects that don't pick up on the first dial. So that sums up sequencing. I want to transition into now, for the next 8 minutes or so, how to pick out a personalized premise and what to personalize on. There's a big question in the industry on what is personalization, what is relevance, and which one is more important. So you'll have half of the people in the industry that say personalization is really, really important, and that's the sword that they want to die on. And then you also have the other half of the industry saying relevance. It's all about relevance, 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 relevance at scale. So my opinion is that you need to tie in both. So I've seen a lot of what's called the 10-80-10 rule in outreach. And what that looks like is this, hi Beck, reason for my outreach is I noticed you went to Texas A&M. We over here at Drift help convert website views into, close one business. And it's like, okay, you were personalized in the front line, in the first line, but the second line, you didn't hook it well enough. So in my opinion, I think that whatever premise that you pick out, whether that's, some kind of article that they wrote, some kind of article that they liked, some kind of article that they commented on, your livelihood and your response rates and how excited people are to talk to you about your business hinges on the second line of like, okay, this is great that you teased out some kind of premise, but can you hook that and be relevant in your second line to your buyer persona? So relevance at scale has been done already. I've seen it, you can quote unquote mass blast templates, that talk all about your buyer persona, pain points, etc. But today I wanted to go ahead and give the rule of thumb that whatever personalized premise that you're picking, kind of the rule of engagement that we have over here at Chorus, is you need to be thinking not through what personalized premise do I pick out, but what personalized premise do I pick out that I could then hook to be relevant to what Chorus does and my buyer in their day-to-day. So with that said, the 5 premise buckets that we are operating off of over here at Chorus, and I will start with the bucket that we get the most engagement with, the most high response rates, down to the least responded rates. Our positive response rates, just for a litmus test, is 24%. Over here for our sequences. I was actually looking through the other day and I was pretty caught off guard by it, but it gives you kind of a litmus test. Our positive response rate is anywhere from 20 to 24% for our sequences. The first bucket that we are picking up for personalized premises is self-authored content. So this is any kind of webinar, article, or post that your prospect has made. So I would go to Sarah Hicks's profile and I would say, okay, is there any webinar that she's been a part of like this? Is there any kind of article that she's written, or is there any kind of post that she's made on LinkedIn that I could then link back to Chorus? And this is my highest response rate. If I had to guess why, it's because you are hitting the dopamine rush of not only telling them that you saw their content, but more so even validating that it was useful. So to all you out there on the line, as soon as this webinar ends, I'm going to walk around my apartment and I'm going to wonder one thing. I'm going to wonder whether you guys got value out of this session. And I'm going to wonder whether this session resonated with you. So I want you guys to go into the chat. Whenever you put a post on LinkedIn, what is the one thing that you want to happen as a result of that post? What's the one thing you're looking for? Bingo. So we got comments, engagement, likes, validation. Does anyone care? Engagement, comments. Was it helpful? Yeah, people to read it, connections, etc. So like that social media is an odd bear. Social media has proved to us one thing, that everyone deep down wants to be famous and that they love being asked questions about their life. And so whenever someone posts something, whether that's, some kind of webinar or article or work that they've done, validating that and telling them that you saw it and that you really liked it is an instant dopamine rush to them, because they realize not only did you take a look at this content, but you received some value. So when I'm walking around my apartment, you know, and wondering whether you guys got value or not, you sending a comment saying like, hey, I love this piece of the webinar, it reassures me that the content was worth it. So this is going to be the strongest bucket for your prospects in terms of response rates for that reason. The second bucket, and Sarah's going to go in very deeply here later, is engaged content. This is anything that your prospect liked, shared, or commented on. And this is what her presentation, where she's going to go and hinge in really deep. But this is basically, it's the second highest response rate, because they are not your prospect isn't the hero. Whoever wrote the post did, but it's still a very, very high response rate when it comes to you know, people positively engaging with your email and setting a meeting because of it. So that's, again, any kind of content that your prospect liked but didn't actually author themselves. Third is going to be self-attributed traits. This is profile line, headline, or company line. This is probably one of my favorite buckets, because it's people talking well about themselves in third person on LinkedIn. So if you go to anyone's LinkedIn page, you know, you'll see in their About Me section, them talking well about themselves in third person. They'll say like, Beck is a badass executor of scaling effective sales teams, whatever. But this is in your prospects' words, what matters to them or things that they think about themselves. And so you can tease one of these out and say like, hey, I just couldn't get enough of your profile line. You know, one line that stood out to me was, it all comes down to great conversations. You know, what if you could ensure that all your reps over at Okta are having great conversations and drive quota attainment as a result? That would be a value prop for Chorus. The fourth drawer, if you can't find anything in those first three, just for kind of like a litmus test, the first three buckets, I typically can find 85 to 90% of the time I can find some kind of premise in those first three buckets. If I can't find something there, then I go into what's called the junk drawer. So this is schools attended, personal interests, or hobbies of your prospect. Again, with the strong asterisk mark of you need to make sure that you hook it back to whatever your company does. So, you know, if I was going to say, you know, Sarah loves grilling, for instance, I don't know if you do, by the way, Sarah, do you like grilling or wine? Which one's better for you?
Wine.
Okay. So
I live in an apartment in Vancouver, so there's no grill at my disposal.
So, you know, let's stick with wine. You know, so if I said like, hi, Sarah, reason for my outreach is I noticed you're a wine aficionado. You know, when it comes down to wine, it's all about highlighting the best flavors. What if you could highlight the best flavors of your sales conversations, you know, double down on the great practices and eliminate the bad and drive more quota attainment as a result? You know, so again, if I'm going to mention Sarah's, you know, affinity for wine, or Sarah's affinity for, you know, running, or, you know, Sarah went to a certain college, or Sarah's Canadian, you know, then I need to figure out some way to link that back to what Chorus does. Otherwise, again, it will come off as a disingenuine, and you'll spike down your engagement rates. And then the last premise bucket, if you can't find anything in the first three, again, self-authored content, engaged content, self-attributed traits, the junk drawer, then I would go to company level. And I would make sure, if I'm talking about someone's company, that I would give some kind of detail that makes them know that you weren't mass blasting. So I've seen a lot of templates in the industry where they're like, hey, I noticed that your company is growing, or my CEO sent me your profile, or my boss wants an update on this account. You know, so it looks personalized, but it's not actually personalized. So people are looking to prove you wrong. You are a salesperson. You are a salesperson that they don't trust, that has no rapport with them. And so I would, advise everyone to pick out some kind of detail. If you're going to go company route, if you're going to go hiring, let's say, you know, the difference between saying, I notice your company is growing, and I notice your company grew 60% over the last 6 months, and you just added a VP of sales and 7 new SDRs. One email, I'm not sure that you know who I am. One email, I am. So if you're going to go company level, again, this is going to be your lowest conversion rate. I would pick out some kind of detail that lets them know that you did personalize. You know, and again, kind of in a summary from the structure piece that we did, and when it came to sequences, You know, if I'm going cold outbound and I don't have a postbound premise, again, in review, that's anything that's not true inbound and not true outbound. If I don't have one of these, then I will mention a bucket premise summary and then an excerpt of something that stood out to me. If I do have a postbound premise, I will say, you know, hey, reason for my outreach is I noticed you attended this webinar. But more importantly, and I will talk about some kind of summary about them in specific. So whereas this case, I would say, hi, Sarah, reason for my outreach is I noticed that you're a aficionado for wine. One line of your profile that stood out to me was it all comes down to the great flavors. You would say in the postbound premise, you know, hey, Sarah, reason for my outreach is I noticed that, a reason for my outreach is I noticed that you attended this webinar on scaling personalization, but more importantly, I saw that you are a lover of wine. So that's how you compare them together. When it comes to inserting personalization, and then I'm going to hand the mic over here to Sarah. But when it comes to inserting personalization into your emails and cold calls, again, I'm not going to go into the back half of the cold call and what the cold call looks like, or emails and, you know, what I think about emails. So if you want any of that content, then you can click on the personalization at scale session that we'll send out afterwards. But in short, where I'm putting the personalization is typically in the first line, you know, of the email. So Google did a study on how you read emails, and your prospects start at 2 o'clock in the email and they go clockwise. So what that tells you about how your prospects read your emails is they're going to read the end of your first line first, end of your last line, beginning of your last line, and then your middle line. So you want to make sure, if this is the most valuable real estate, you want to make sure, instead of talking about, hello, my name is Beck and I work with Verizon Wireless and we're awesome for all these reasons, you want to make sure that you hit them with something about them so that it diffuses them just long enough to where they'll read the rest of the email and they'll figure out what you want and reply as a result. When it comes to personalizing within a cold call, I do it right off the bat. So I say, you know, hey, Sarah, this is Beck calling from Chorus. Calling on a recorded line from Chorus. How have you been? We can role play it. You know, why don't I ring you and you pick up?
Sure.
Ring.
Hello.
Hey, is this Sarah?
Yeah.
Hey, Sarah, this is Beck calling on a recorded line with Chorus. How have you been?
I'm good. Yeah. You?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. Hey, the reason for my outreach is I was looking at your LinkedIn profile the other day and I saw this article that you wrote on scaling personalization. And one line that stood out to me was it's all about reverse engineering. So I was curious to know if you've come across Chorus before.
I have actually. We use it.
So yeah, so a timeout. Yeah, in this case, they actually already use it, but you guys can get the gist of right off the bat. If you are personalizing, and if someone asks me a question there, if they ask like, you know, who are you, Chorus? Oh, aren't you competing with X, Y, and Z? I always say that's a great question. And I get back into my personalization. So it usually diffuses them long enough in that first 10 seconds, you know, to help them understand that like I have done something that most reps, 99.9% repeating reps have not done. I know who they are whenever I'm calling them. So, you know, I'll tell the story and then I'll finish with this and hand the mic over to Sarah. But I had a rep a couple of months ago. He came up to me and he said, hey, I really need to talk. And there's a rep on the team over here at Chorus. His name's Chris. I'm going to give him a shout out. He'll love that. And I said, yeah, sure. What's up? I was like, walk and talk. I was on the way to a meeting. And he said, so someone hung up on me. I was like, okay. He was like, yeah, they hung up. And I was like, oh my gosh, Chris, they're going to do so much worse to you in your career. So he had been deploying this personalized messaging so long that was normal to him, that he had never had someone, you know, hang up the phone on him. So I would implore people, you know, to figure out who your prospect is, find something relevant about them, find something that they did, something that they said, and use it within those first 15 seconds as ammo to get them to understand that you know who you are and you've done the research, you deserve to be there. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Sarah. I'm going to stop sharing, and Sarah, why don't you kick it off with how you reverse engineered the approach?
Yeah, sounds good. Let me just get my screen sharing here and we'll make sure that everyone can see. All look good? Nice.
Great.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much, Beck. obviously I learned about this whole approach from Beck, her Personalization at Scale webinar, which yeah, she'll for sure share afterwards. And that approach is sort of tailored towards an ABM approach, an account-based approach with sales. And that's not exactly how we were doing our sales development at Predictable Revenue. So I was kind of looking at a way that I could personalize the outreach that I was doing, but that didn't require the heavy research right off the bat on each of these prospects. So as Beck mentioned, her first step in that sequence is that LinkedIn research. And I wasn't always 100% sure of what accounts I was going to be reaching out to. So I was trying to find a way that I could kind of on the fly send out these really personalized messages. And that's sort of like an oxymoron in itself. Like, how could I just randomly come up with personalization? So it was definitely something that was always on the forefront of my mind. And I was always trying to find something. And then I watched the Personalization at Scale webinar. And I thought, why couldn't I basically do the reverse? And I'll break down what that means. This belongs to Beck's second bucket of personalization premises. It was that liked and commented and shared bucket. This one doesn't actually tackle shared. It's more focused on the likes and the comments, but I'll break down exactly how you guys can do it. But basically, I achieved 130% of my quota the first month that I tried this. So loved it and have been using it ever since. So the first kind of topic that I'll be covering is how to find prospects by looking at engagement on thought leaders' posts in your industry. So this is kind of the step-by-step of how to get there. So the first thing that you want to do is follow thought leaders in your space and kind of keep a sheet or keep a list of who the top ones are, or who the ones are that keep consistently posting great content and have high engagement, that kind of thing, so that you can always go back and check on their profiles, see if they've posted anything new. From there, you want to keep an eye out for if they post anything relevant. I'll speak to what I kind of mean by relevance in a little bit. And you want to make sure that that LinkedIn post has high engagement. I'll also specify what I mean there. The third step is I have a sheet going at all times where I can save the links to these great posts so that I'm stockpiling. And whenever it's time to write a new sequence, I've got something ready for me right there. I've got first name, last name, link to the post, my little excerpt, and why I think that it's a good post for me to use for this. And step 4, when you're ready to make a new sequence and you need a new sequence, here's how you do it. So in terms of finding a great post, this is the viable post checklist. So number 1, the post is written by a popular thought leader in my space. For Predictable Revenue, those of you that know us, we're obviously in the sales space, in the sales development and outbound space. So for us, some great thought leaders would be people like Jake Dunlap, Colin Cadmus, Mark A. Smith, Beck Holland. That's how we got here. And number 2 for the checklist is that the content of the post is relevant to what we do at my company. So that might be a pain that we solve or a topic that we're knowledgeable about, something like that. And the reason for that is I want to be able to tie in this content. Like Beck mentioned, I want to be able to hook that content into my value prop in a very clear and concise way. So for instance, for Predictable Revenue, the post could be anything around sales development, around prospecting, around different outbound strategies, email templates, cold calling tactics, anything like that. I'm very easily going to be able to, hook, as Beck said, into my value prop. And the very last point on the checklist for a viable post is that the post has upwards of 100 likes or reactions and upwards of 50 comments. And the reason for that is not every single person that's going to have engaged is going to fit my ICP. So I want to start with a large enough sample size that once I've pared away the wrong people, I still have enough to kind of make it worth my while to reach out to them and to build the sequence around the post. So as you can see on the left here, this is an example. This was actually the very, very first post that I used to build this type of sequence. It's by Jake Dunlap. So he hits my first box of popular thought leader in my space. Number two, content of the post is relevant. This is like the most relevant post that could ever have existed because it's literally about predictable revenue. And it was about how the predictable revenue model and the methodology was obviously created over 10 years ago and was a bit dated. And so Jake was saying, like, predictable revenue used to be the thing to follow. Maybe it's not anymore. Maybe we need to do something else. And one of the things he mentioned was we need creativity, outcomes, and automations to make sure our people are doing their best work every day, which is very different from what the predictable revenue book preached at the time, which was cold calling 2.0, which was essentially like relevance at scale, the way that you mentioned, the kind of, it can be a mass blast. But actually, as a company, we have been doing a lot of things to stay on the forefront and on the cutting edge, and running a lot of different experiments. We've got a team in-house called Outbound Labs, whose entire responsibility is to kind of test new outbound strategies, that kind of thing. And so I was like, you know what? This is perfect. I can easily hook in what we do to what's been said here. And so I gave it a go, and I built this sequence around this post. So, oh, there we go. So this is the kind of template for the initial email. This is the same structure that Beck uses for the initial emails. So it's hi, first name, whoever. Premise was I either saw you liked or I saw you commented on thought leaders' LinkedIn post about the predictable revenue model being outdated, for instance. What really captured my attention was, and for this, I either quote an excerpt from the main post if the person has just liked the post, or I can actually quote an excerpt from their comment if it was something relevant. And then my what if question is my hook, tying the content of the premise there into our value prop. So whatever has been mentioned in the content of this post, let me tie my value prop to that, and with a what if question. So for instance, the predictable revenue methodology is outdated. What if I told you that we have been running experiments to stay on the forefront, and we can actually provide you with multi-channel personalized prospecting at scale, which is not what predictable revenue was known for before. And then my call to action, same as Beck's, give me a chance to unpack that on a quick call. How's your calendar looking on whatever day? All right, so here are a couple of examples. This one is the example for if the prospect has just liked the post. So the way that you kind of phrase that and piece it all together. Hi, John, saw you liked Jake Dunlap's post about the predictable revenue methodology being too predictable. The part that really captured my attention was, now touch points are less predictable in leading directly to a meeting. We need creativity, outcomes, and automation. And if you guys remember, that was a quote directly from Jake Dunlap's post. And then what if we could provide you with creative, outcome-driven, multi-channel prospecting at scale, call to action. And here's the example for if the prospect commented something relevant. There's a little caveat here. Sometimes people are gonna comment things that are irrelevant, that are not helpful. Like people might be like, oh, preach, love this, or tag their friend in it or something. You obviously don't have to quote that kind of thing. In that case, I would just revert back to the same template as if the person liked it, but you can still say, I saw your comment on so-and-so's post, but just quote an excerpt from the original post. But in the case that they do comment something relevant, which is ideal because it goes back to what Beck was talking about, that some piece of self-authored something and getting validation from you finding value in that. So for instance, hi, Andrea, I saw your comment on Todd Capone's post about making cold emails, that's supposed to say, cold emails stand out to prospects. You mentioned it's important to mention what matters to them and a hypothesis on what might help. So that's actually an excerpt from Andrea's comment. What if we could help you nail messaging based on discovering the pain and provide you with creative, outcome-driven, multi-channel prospecting at scale, CTA. Cool, so transitioning now into topic 2, which is on how to actually build these lists and actually sequence the prospects. Again, using outreach as an example, that's what we use in-house, but again, this will be pretty transferable across any of the sales engagement tools. So when building the list for your LinkedIn engagement campaign, you I would add 2 additional columns to the list that you're building. So whatever data you guys usually have when you're building lists, of course, keep all that. And then just on the far side, on the far right, add a liked column and a commented column. In those columns, you're going to put in the liked column, if they liked it, you're going to mark that somehow, whether that's throwing in a yes, throwing in the word liked. And then in the commented column, you're going to copy and paste that comment. Yeah, so the reason for this is that when you're uploading these contacts, these lists into Outreach, you want to be able to map that data, map that information onto the contact or into your sequence. This way you can either fully automate the sequences, or as Beck showed you, you can have it showing up as custom notes on the contact object, so that every time you come up to call them, every time you come up to write a personalized email, whatever that might be, that shows up right there in front of you. So within Outreach, you can, of course, create your custom fields and call them whatever you want. So this is just an example down there of how to do that, so that you're making sure that you're keeping that information when you're uploading these contacts. So there are definitely questions that I had when looking at this kind of thing. Of course, it seems like a little bit of manual labor in some ways when it comes to writing out the sequences or writing out these emails or building these lists. And as Beck mentioned, anything that you can prove as being scalable has got to have kind of a repeatable structure in place, and you've got to be able, it has to be repeatable. And so this is something that I actually thought, could I take it to different predictable revenue clients? Could I look at using it in different industries? Could I look at using it for industries who maybe aren't very active on LinkedIn? Like, what were the different challenges that may come up, and how can I make sure to mitigate those? Because otherwise, how can I possibly claim that this is a scalable method? So one of the challenges that I kind of came up with and that might exist would be, what if I can't find any thought leaders in my industry on LinkedIn? And what if the people engaging with that LinkedIn post by a thought leader don't fit my ICP? So one of the great ways that I think you can get around that is if you check on Twitter. So for instance, when I was having a look at predictable revenue clients and how this might work, we've got a client in the health tech space, not very active in terms of thought leaders on LinkedIn. That being said, actually quite a few thought leaders active on Twitter. So, and you can take pretty much the same approach here. You'd be looking at who's liking, who's retweeting, that kind of thing. And then probably you'd want to just search their names in LinkedIn and follow pretty much the rest of the process like that, like you would with the LinkedIn engagement. And in terms of if the people engaging in the LinkedIn post aren't within your ICP, this is a pretty tough one to mitigate. I think the way to do that is to go back to Beck's original account-based approach, because that in that way you can build lists based on who is for sure engaging. For instance, if you go in Sales Navigator, you can build lists of people and then filter based on LinkedIn activity in the past 30 days. So if you've got a list, whether it's from Postbound or whether it's a cold outbound list that you know you want to reach out to, whatever that might be, you can cross-reference that in Sales Navigator and make sure you're only reaching out to people with LinkedIn activity. And then that's great personalization stuff for you to draw on. In terms of the challenge of the time that would go into something like this in terms of list building and the tasks themselves, yeah, it does take a little bit of time to click through the people who liked and commented to build these lists. That being said, because there is kind of a really high yield, if you've got a bit of time, I think it's 100% worthwhile. As I mentioned, I achieved 130% of my quota from this. There have been consistently high response rates, positive response rates, all that kind of stuff. So if you've got a bit of extra time, definitely worthwhile. If you do have somebody like a research team or anybody that has a bit of time dedicated to list building, something like that, definitely a great time to lean on them and ask them for their help. And then a little bit of time spent for the cutting and pasting within that template. Because as you guys saw, the template as it kind of stands says, I saw your like/comment on so-and-so's post. So there's a bit of cutting and pasting to make sure that the template is accurate to each prospect that you're reaching out to. But in sequencing and importing those contacts correctly with the mapping as we showed you, that mitigates a bit of that because those notes are right there in front of you. And you actually can use those custom variables to completely automate these sequences if you'd like to. There would be a little bit more work on the front end if that was what you wanted to give a go. For instance, you wouldn't even bother copying and pasting those comments that were things like preach, tag my friend. You would just copy and paste a relevant piece or a relevant excerpt from comments, put them in that commented field. And then when you actually built out the sequence, you could do one sequence for liked, one sequence for commented. The liked would be very simple, of course, to just go like that. And the commented sequence, you would use a custom variable for the part that really stood out to me was, and then that would be the excerpt from their comment. So that's a way to make this a little bit less time consuming and a slightly different way to do it. Maybe if you have a lot of sequences that you need to do and you don't have necessarily the time for that cutting and pasting, or even if you're the one responsible for building these lists yourself and you're going to take a little bit more time from clicking through everybody, maybe that's a way to speed up the second half. But yeah, I think at this point, we want to open it up to some questions. Saw lots of people typing away down there, and we'd love to address some of your questions. Yeah.
I love it. Awesome. Yeah, thank you guys so much. You guys have been sending in some incredible questions here. So let's dive in. Sarah, since you just started talking, I'm actually going to put a question to you that has been coming up a lot, especially in the chat and in the Q&A, basically asking, what if the majority of your customers or prospects aren't active on social? So, or especially specifically on LinkedIn, how do you go about, where do you find the personalization premise buckets in that?
Absolutely. So this whole approach really is tailored towards those that are active on social media. It does fall into that second premise bucket of Beck's that was the likes, comments, and shares. So it does require them to be active on LinkedIn to some degree. That being said, if you don't find that your people are active there, you've got to fall back on the other premise buckets that Beck outlined. And there's plenty of stuff there. Maybe that's going to be going on the website and looking at press stuff. That's probably where I would go next. But specifically for this exact type of sequence, it's for those that are active on social media.
Awesome. Thank you. Beck, question from Michael Scully. How do you maintain personalization tactics when you're processing hundreds of new contacts each week and your time is limited?
Yeah, so I saw that question in the chat. Something to add, by the way, on Sarah's session, if you Google flip the script, we'll send it in the follow-up email, but I did a session on if they're not active on LinkedIn, because I imagine a lion's share of you, or, you know, I don't know the percentage on the line, you'll say like my prospect isn't active on LinkedIn, or they're, but I'll send out that session, you know, in the follow-up email. But to Michael's question, I mean, I would honestly have to ask you a couple of discovery questions of like, what do you mean by processing hundreds of leads? And, you know, is that inbound and outbound both? And, you know, or are you just going outbound? So a lot of people, you know, their main tie back with personalization would be like, okay, well, it's not scalable because I want to send out 100 messages. And so I always get people to ask themselves the question, what are you trying to scale? So, I mean, at the end of the day, I think that people are trying to scale results, but in the meantime, they scaled volume because they thought that was the way to get there. And that's the only lever that has been pulled. So this, full disclosure, I mean, my teams are up to 25 emails and 52 cold calls per day. So we 4X at my first company, 3X at my second company, and 6X in my first month over here at Chorus because of that volume. But one of the first things that I did whenever I deployed the approach was I cut them back from 100 cold calls and 50 emails per day all the way back to 10 emails and 20 cold calls per day. And that's what 4X them. So if you're going through hundreds of leads, you know, my biggest question would be, I would ask why. You know, just so you know, as a litmus test, we have a maximum of they can hold 200 accounts in their name. Because at the end of the day, it's like, you know, maybe you send out all of this mass blast email and you gobble up You know, you get a whole bunch of meetings in the beginning. Like I've seen a bunch of outsource firms do that. You know, they send out a whole bunch of mass blast templates based on buyer persona, get a whole bunch of meetings, but then their TAM is cooked and everyone doesn't want to hear from it anymore. And they hit the unsubscribe button and, you know, they're blocked and it hurt their email domain. So, you know, my biggest question that would be, you know, why are you targeting hundreds of leads? And is there a possibility that you could scale back the volume of leads that you're chasing after? Because I don't think, you know, any kind of messaging that's just relevant and not personalized, you can use marketing platforms to do it. So Marketo, you can send out an email that looks like it's sent from you, and any messaging that you don't personalize, you could use, you know, you don't need a physical person for that. So I would, you know, have to ask a couple of discovery questions, but my challenge to you would be, you know, scale it back to 150 accounts. I think no more than 200 can you really keep your mind on when it comes to an ABM approach.
Awesome. Yeah,
Long
that was
answer.
as always. No, it's good. I have a question for you, Sarah. This one comes from Benjamin. It's a great strategy. How would you suggest going about it if your team works in territories and segments? So maybe this is for both you and Beck. By the time an SDR sifts through every prospect that liked and commented, finds their territory and then their segment, they may only have a few prospects from that post that they can actually reach out to.
Yeah, that's definitely very true. In that case, though, if you've got a bunch of SDRs that are working on all of the different territories that you guys cover, if each of them is using this approach, theoretically it would even out. So if they can have some kind of working doc or some kind of communication between them where they can share the contacts that are in each other's territories, that would be a way to just keep the communication open. The way that my colleague and I did it, we were both doing this approach. We both had a list of thought leaders that we were following just so that we weren't kind of using the same posts. And so we had a working sheet showing what we were using, what posts we were using. I could imagine you could do something like that where you could just split up the contacts based on territory. And then that way they would just be kind of sharing the load and yeah.
Yeah, I would add the same thing to Sarah. That approach is more so built for SMB teams or smaller teams. And if you're doing geo or territory segmentation, you know, what we did over here at Chorus is like, we're effectively trying to monetize LinkedIn. Like, so for example, I try and, you know, put like, hey, if anyone wants these slides, you know, comment slides below. And I got like 1,500 comments. I'm like, what the hell am I going to do with all these people? On a side note, super encouraging, but what am I going to do with all of this? And it's like, LinkedIn has made it very, very difficult on us to monetize it because they don't want it to be a monetizable engine. They want it to be a community where people can share their thoughts and actually, you know, understand what's going on. And so, you know, kind of same thing as to Sarah. We just split up the workload of like, okay, on this first post, you know, Chris is going to do all the legwork and round robin. And on the second post, Karina is going to do all the legwork and round robin. On the third post, Kiki's going to do all the legwork and round robin, so that like hypothetically you divide out the workload, and then hypothetically, you know, it's kind of like an inbound approach. It's really hard to control like like equality and making sure everyone has even limits. That's almost like saying like, hey, I want to lose 20 pounds, but I want to lose it only in my stomach and my thighs. Like, you know, it's just impossible to do. So, but I would suggest same thing of like just divvying up the workload.
So we are at time, but I do want to end with this question from John Gomez about how do you deploy this strategy with enterprise accounts? Anything different from small and medium businesses? Since you just touched on that, I felt like you could expand on it a bit.
Yeah, John, that was his name, John? Did I get that right? John, could you put into the chat, did you mean how to deploy this if you are an enterprise or SMB account, or how to deploy this on an SMB or enterprise account? On the enterprise accounts, yes. So your approach, honestly, the difference between selling to mid-market and enterprise to me is you can sell in at a lower quote unquote level. So SMB, we just end up going in higher. You know, mid-market, like SMB, we're going to aim for a CRO, VP of sales, or CEO, because that's the decision maker. Mid-market, we're going to aim for usually like a vice president or a head of, because that's the decision maker. And then a great example is, Chorus is working with Adobe, and we sold into a senior manager, Jake Rennie, at the time. And so it's like, for those different accounts, usually the bigger kind of companies that you get, your target and who the decision maker is, and who has power and who has budget and authority, et cetera, is going to lower, because manager or director at an enterprise firm means a hell of a lot. Whereas at an SMB company, it doesn't necessarily mean you have all that decision-making power. So in terms of the approach, this is just my perspective, but it's not like someone at a mid-market company likes personalization and someone in enterprise doesn't, or someone at an SMB company likes you to focus on them, but someone at mid-market doesn't. So in my use case, a lot of people have asked, this is just in my experience, a lot of people have asked like, oh, well, should I personalize to VPs and not personalize to managers? And it's like, I think that you should just define where your bar is of where you can sell into. And in my experience, frontline managers or manager level role like it even more than a vice president, because a manager, someone who's a frontline manager typically doesn't get a ton of really personalized outreach and a ton of attention and a ton of glory. And so in my experience, they're actually more responsive to this approach the lower down that you go, still above ICP, but the lower down that you go, because they don't get that much outreach that's based all about them, whereas a VP or CRO, a lot of times people will focus in on them. Sarah, anything to add on that?
Oh, muted. I don't think so. I think, yeah, it's going to be the same regardless of who you're reaching out to. Personalization is the utmost of utmost importance either way. So it makes sense that you would, kind of take the same approach.
Awesome. Any more questions, Sarah? Or are we done?
We are at time, but I really think it would be nice. There were 2 questions that came in all around changing and adapting this approach to fit the current times, especially having to do with COVID-19. So if you want to just take us out with some of your thoughts on how to really adapt this approach to the current climate, that would be great.
Yeah. Sarah, do you want to lead? And then I'll follow up.
Sure. The biggest thing, and I'm sure lots of you have been hearing this from everybody, I feel like it's the consensus right now, but empathy absolutely has to be what you're leading with. And relevance and personalization is even more important. So the way that we've been kind of adjusting our approach internally is now's the time more for relationship building than actually trying to push deals across the line. So something that I'm including in my outreach all the time is, because I don't know how much any given company has been affected by what's going on. I don't know how much the person that I'm reaching out to has been affected by what's going on. Kind of near the end of my email, I'm saying now may not be the right time for you guys to purchase new services. That I understand, but I do believe that during a downturn, it's the time to see what is out there that can help you pick up the slack when the time comes. Is that a conversation that you guys want to have right now? Something along those lines. And I've been finding that those who are responding are actually that much more ready to move forward, because those that don't find it's the right time will say that right away, and that's great, and I leave them alone. But those that agree with me are then that much more motivated to move forward.
Yeah, a couple things I would add to this, and this is going to be a long monologue, so full disclosure, thanks everyone for coming. If you want to bounce off the line, I totally understand. But when it comes to COVID, it's going to be a long monologue just so I can explain to you what we've been doing over here. But the first thing I would suggest to any company selling during COVID is understanding, how does your platform, how does your service, how does your product enable people in the current environment? So a great example is, Chorus, we make sellers better. That's our whole value prop, is we make sellers better and understand where they messed up and where they did well. During COVID, I repivoted everyone to how we enable people to sell remotely really well. So I started talking about how you can keep your reps accountable, and understand if they're multi-threading, and understand if they're, adhering to your training, or, cross-team collaboration while teams are working from home. So the first thing that I did was repositioned our value prop to understand, like, how does Chorus enable people to sell remotely better versus how does it help people, in general. So I would challenge everyone to rethink, how does your platform, how does your service, or, how does what you have to offer enable people in the current time. Second thing that I would do is I would deploy what's called a push-pull technique, and we can send out a session afterwards that I did under Flip the Script. But basically what the push-pull technique is, it is enabling your prospect to understand that either way, you're still a big fan of their content. So the last hinge line that we include in every single email at Chorus is like, if you give me a shot Wednesday at 4 to unpack how VPs of sales leverage, blah, blah, blah. And then it's like, either way, keep the good content coming. I'm such a big fan of your team, and hope you're well. So in that either way section for all of our emails, we are now including, like, either way, hope your team is safe during this time, and that you're, you can fill in the blanks, but basically pairing a last line in your email that is talking about that either way, whether they buy you or not, whether they give you the chance or not, or give you any time or not, that they, that they're safe during everything going on. COVID is really tricky. And then I'll hit you with the last point and I'll sign off. COVID is really tricky. If you mention COVID, people think that you are monetizing a pandemic. If you don't mention COVID, then they say that you're insensitive and you don't have any empathy to you. So to me, you need to talk about all how your platform, enables people during this kind of climate, and then tell them that either way that they're safe, so that you're not necessarily mentioning it. And then the third and last thing that I'm doing with the reps over here is, normally I give this big long objection handling course on and telling people that, Sandler says that your prospects lie to you all the time, and it's true. They say, send me an email when they have no intention of opening the email. They say, like, oh, not the right time, not interested, not the right person, just because they want to get off the phone and they don't want to feel like a bad person. Makes sense. And so I usually give my team the advice that the 95-5 objection handling rule, that 95% of the time it is a false objection, that you need to pattern interrupt and chatter through, and 5% of the time it's real. And if you try and counter a real objection, you're going to piss off your prospect. Now during this climate, I backed it up to like the 50-50 objection handling rule of, like, 50% of the time, now more than ever, their objections are true objections. So they're going to say, like, hey, we just went through a bunch of layoffs, or hey, my budgets just got cut, or hey, I'm wondering whether I'm going to have a job on Monday, and their objections are realer than ever. So you need to be very, very, light in your pattern interrupts and understanding during that section, because now more than ever, like I said, their objections are real. And so if I'm thinking about that I have to lay off 200 people tomorrow, the last thing I'm going to be thinking about is software. So I try to get them to avoid the industries that are taking the most hit, avoid the people that are, having to lay off people, avoid the people that, are in the event space, for instance, and understand that more of their objections are going to be realer than ever. But all that said, I don't think it relinquishes the need to sell during this time. People are like, well, are you going to lay us off? And then they're like, well, are you going to reduce our quota? And it's like, well, one or the other. You either need to learn how to pivot and sell during, a pandemic and something like this, or you need to be okay with, your company saying, like, we just can't hold you on board. But, I would say, I don't think it relinquishes, to Sarah's point kind of earlier, I don't think it relinquishes the need for you to cold call. I don't think it relinquishes the need for you to send emails. I think it needs to pivot your strategy, but we just need to learn how to adapt. We need to learn how to be agile, but we don't need to just hang up the phone and say, like, no one's going to pick up because of everything that's going on. That said, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Sarah, for being a part of this, and for all
thank
the
you so much for
approach. That was awesome. Sarah, anything to add?
I don't think so. Yeah, thanks everybody for watching. Thank you to the Chorus team and to Beck for having me on and having Predictable Revenue as a guest. So grateful to be able to share this. And I'm obviously forever grateful about all the content that Bex puts out there, because it's obviously helped me a ton. And yeah, I hope that you guys get some great value out of this. Feel free to send me a connection request on LinkedIn, ask me any question that comes up that didn't get answered here. I'm happy to answer.
Thank you so much for coming on today. And thank you to everyone for showing up on the line. And we will send out a follow-up email with all those decks that we mentioned earlier.
Bye.
Bye.